Persona 3 was a genre-defining RPG. It established the basic gameplay formula that the modern Persona titles follow, and many other RPGs take inspiration from. But its original incarnation has been stranded on the PS2 for over 15 years, without good options to enjoy the title on modern hardware. Enter Persona 3 Reload. This is a complete, top-to-bottom remake of Persona 3 for modern consoles and PC, seeking to revitalize and revamp the title for contemporary expectations. So is this the remake that fans have been waiting for? And are the graphics an evolution from other recent Atlus efforts? Let's start with what works well. Persona 3 Reload's UI design in particular is really special. The game's main in-game menu is probably the best example. All the various submenus transition beautifully and have really striking designs centered around the main character, animated as if he was immersed in water, with the background still visible behind the blue UI elements. The fonts and shapes here are very reminiscent of Persona 3, but infused with a more adventurous Persona 5 style design sensibility, and I think it works extremely well. The UI elements in other areas of the game are up to the same high standard. The battle menus mix 2D seamlessly with 3D elements, with some very fluid animation work. A lot of shapes and visual elements from Persona 3 are represented here, but the new UI is much more visually exciting. All the various interstitial screens, cutaways, and dialogue scenes all exhibit the same high-caliber UI work. It's engaging without being at all overwhelming or hard to read, and the reliance on simple blue and white tones keeps the UI looking clean. Persona 3 Reload has some of the most inventive and confident UI work that I've seen in video games. Reload backs up its UI design with some very compelling animation in 3D content as well. The battle sequences in particular often look stunning, with great looking attacks and special abilities. The splashy Fiora G moves, which are a new addition in Reload, are probably the highlight here. Elaborate show-stopping finishing moves, like the Showtime attacks in Persona 5 Royal. I think this game has the best combat animation of any Persona series entry to date, which keeps the turn-based battles engaging. Character models are another high point. The main cast's outfits are as stylish as ever, and each character sports a healthy amount of model detail. Unlike the original Persona 3, which relied on chibi-style 3D models with large heads, the characters are rendered with normal proportions here. That means the updated character portraits blend seamlessly with the 3D art, always matching the on-screen models. The lighting generally gives them a bit of a cel-shaded appearance with bright edge highlights, which keeps them crisp, clean, and easily distinguishable against the environment. The models for enemy characters are a little less detailed, I'd say, but still animate effectively and have distinctive looks. Longtime SMT and Persona fans will feel a bit of familiarity here though, as the models from Persona 5, SMT5, and Soul Hackers 2 have been reused here again. There's nothing wrong with a bit of asset reuse, and there are new enemies to fight as well, but a lot of these foes were designed around the constraints of the PS3, which is a bit evident in close-ups. Another strong point, and a highly unexpected one, is the game's use of ray-traced reflections. At first glance, I thought we might be looking at a planar reflection technique, but the noise patterns and variable glossiness that are sometimes visible in the reflections seem to indicate RT, at least on the Series X as we're seeing here. To figure it out properly, I took a look at the PC build, which has a very basic settings menu. Here we don't actually have any options for reflections beyond on or off. I tested some scenes with DirectX ray tracing turned off using NVIDIA Profile Inspector, and we get a screen space reflection fallback instead of the full screen reflections that are otherwise present. It's weird that the PC code doesn't offer in-game control over the kind of reflections that are being used, but the DXR trick essentially gives us confirmation that we're looking at an RT technique here. The RT reflections are fairly conservative. I didn't spot them on any curved surfaces, and they're often present in scenes with limited camera control. But they do give the game a certain sense of depth on surfaces like mirrors and windows that we otherwise don't see, and their quality level is fairly high. In one in-game sequence where reflections are gameplay critical, I believe Persona 3 Reload is using planar reflections, but elsewhere I couldn't find evidence of the technique. Some reflections also seem to rely on screen space techniques, which work fine but suffer from disocclusion issues. The game's post-processing in general, including bloom lighting, depth of field, SSR, and motion blur, all look suitably modern and smooth. Atlus used Unreal Engine 4 for this effort, whereas other mainline Persona titles were built on renderware or in-house tech, and the post-processing provides the clearest evidence of UE4's advantages. Atlus is being somewhat restrained here though. Motion blur, for instance, isn't present during gameplay unless the protagonist is sprinting, and depth of field isn't featured in gameplay or dialogue sequences. Finally, I think the game's cutscenes are worth commenting on as well. These mostly take the form of anime-style sequences, just like the original game, although these cutscenes seem to be fully reanimated. I think they lend the game a certain characteristic Persona flair, although these do tend to be somewhat slower-paced sequences. I did, however, notice that in the original Persona 3, these cutscenes seem to be more common. Take this sequence for example. Persona 3 FES uses a hand-drawn anime-style 2D cutscene, while Reload uses a simple 3D diorama. For the more action-packed stuff, we sometimes see bombastic in-engine cutscenes, which are used sparingly but look terrific. In this scene, an in-engine 3D cutscene takes the place of an anime-style cutscene from the original, and both versions give a good result, I'd say. Unlike prior Atlus games though, these do appear to be pre-rendered and display at a fixed 30 FPS. So that's what works. So what doesn't? The game's environmental lighting is probably its biggest flaw. We see a lot of very flat-looking environments without much color differentiation, like in the dormitory here. Regions that should have some sort of large-scale occlusion simply don't. We still have shadow maps, which look fine, and there is a form of ambient occlusion, though it's very subtle, but we don't see the same high-quality baked lighting that we see in some other UE4 titles. If you look closely, you can sometimes spot a mismatch between the dynamic lighting in the game and the environmental lighting, which looks especially bizarre in the dormitory. The in-game light sources really suggest the room should be much darker, with a more contrasty and vibrant lighting presentation. That said, some environments do look better than others. The school area generally looks reasonable enough, and some of the segments set in the dark hour, which feature dramatic color shifts, look sharp and striking, but the general lighting presentation is a disappointment. The original Persona 3 notably didn't suffer from these issues. The dormitory, for instance, is dark, moody, and clearly shadowed, with good pre-calculated lighting for a PS2 title. Reload arguably looks worse here, and I really don't know why Atlus wanted to make the lighting presentation so uniform now. Other areas do capture the spirit of the original more effectively, but it still often looks off relative to the PS2 title. Even though it's ultimately just a bit of a screen space hack, I think changing the SSAO parameters or method might improve the game's visual presentation quite a bit. Here, I've injected the SSDO technique in Gloom AO into the PC version of the game using Reshade, which can give the game a more grounded and dynamic look. It's not perfect by any means. There are some obvious errors when RT is on screen, it's a bit heavy-handed, and the SSDO can cause some inappropriate looking color contribution from some objects. But I think something like this would be a step in the right direction. It would be interesting to see if the community can come up with a better SSAO injection for Persona 3 Reload, or a mod to improve things further. Of course, the ideal intervention would be if Atlus themselves improved the SSAO, which is exactly what we saw with Forspoken last year. That game had a very flat lighting presentation in its original guise on both PS5 and PC, but was later updated with a more extensive SSAO that filled in a lot of the lighting flaws in the original. It depended heavily on SSAO for ambient lighting, but it certainly looked better with the revised technique. Persona 3 Reload might be able to enjoy a similar graphical uplift with some extra effort. The other key issue is that the environments tend to be quite plain, lacking geometric detail. There's very little environmental adornment, with a lot of flat surfaces, simple objects, and occasionally awkward-looking normal maps. At its best, the game can look very clean and clear as a result, but most of the time the environments just look overly simple. If we step back to Persona 5, the environmental density isn't outstanding or anything like that, but it does display denser, more complex outdoor areas, and that game was originally developed around the PS3. I think a lot of these problems would be easier to overlook if the lighting quality in Reload was better, but as it stands, a lot of the environments tend to look very stark and flat. Reload is still a cross-gen title, but last-gen machines are more than capable of producing complex, exciting environments, at least relative to what we're seeing here. Those two issues do annoy, and it took a while to get used to the way the environments look in typical play. The combat arenas look decent enough, and there are some areas, like the school, where the aesthetic comes together reasonably well, but I would say the game does have a deficit in environmental rendering relative to expectations. This is something that I certainly noticed pre-release, and I know many other prospective players observed as well, but at least there is some hope that the lighting could be improved post-release. There are some other occasional issues that players might come across. Third-person camera control can be a touch awkward, with the right stick sometimes not responding immediately to a change in direction. There are some other little camera oddities when the camera is semi-fixed, like it is when exploring the game's city environments. And there are some other occasional bits of production weirdness, like how most of the crowd in the nightclub here doesn't animate. Overall, I think Persona 3 Reload is a good-looking game, when enjoyed on its own terms. But there are some areas that aren't quite up to the standards we'd expect from a release in 2024. I'm going to work through the console comparisons here fairly quickly because Persona 3 Reload is a fairly straightforward game in terms of visual settings. The Series X and PS5 look about the same here, except for some minor lighting differences I did notice sometimes. The RT quality appears very similar across both consoles. Series S looks similar again, but RT reflections seem to have been cut from the game entirely, with a screen space solution in their place. Shadow resolution also appears to have taken a hit. Resolution-wise, the PS5 and Series X both appear to run at a full 4K in typical play. Dynamic resolution may be a possibility, but both systems resolved a full 2160p pixel count in the shots I tested. I don't think an anti-aliasing solution is in use here though, as both consoles look pretty raw. Some UI elements do appear less clear as well, and don't seem to be at 4K. The Series S, in contrast, renders at just 1080p, again without obvious anti-aliasing, which is a bit of a disappointment considering the lack of ray tracing on that console. From a typical TV viewing distance, I don't think it looks bad or anything, but it does look substantially softer, and there is a fair bit of additional breakup in the image. All consoles target and hit a full 60 FPS in typical play. I didn't notice any particular frame rate issues on any platform in my experience, except for a few moments on the Series X in the mall here, where the frame rate can dip below 60. That makes sense, given the extensive use of RT reflections on the floor and water in this shot. It's possible the same dips could recur on the PS5, but in the material I played on that platform, the game stuck to 60. Series S also hit a perfect 60 FPS in my gameplay. Pre-encoded cutscenes, including the anime cutscenes and 3D sequences, are encoded at 30 FPS, and play back without frame pacing issues. One upshot of the game's limited environmental fidelity is that it's able to hit high resolution and frame rate metrics, at least on the premium consoles. There are very few titles that achieve a 60 FPS update at 4K with RT features on consoles, but the restrained environment rendering makes that target more realistic here. As a game, I think Persona 3 Reload is a very accomplished remake effort. Persona 3 defined the modern Persona game formula, with the main character alternating between building social links and exploring dungeons, all organized around an in-game calendar with a fixed amount of time. But Reload brings in some conveniences and quality of life improvements from Persona 5, like the use of an in-game cell phone to trigger social links, though it is a flip phone as Persona 3 remains set in 2009. There's also some additional content, like extra evening social link activities to enjoy with the members of SEAS. All social links are now fully voice acted, which is a nice touch and an improvement over the text-based conversations mostly featured in prior Persona titles. The dialogue is partially rewritten too, most notably with characters now addressing each other by their last names. Combat enjoys the biggest changes. Unlike Persona 3 and Persona 3 FES, all party members are fully controllable at all times, which greatly expands the strategic options available to the player. Characters can shift, which hands off their current turn to another party member after striking a critical hit, making it easy to chain combos together. The aforementioned theurgy attacks have been added, which take a while to build up but prove very satisfying. The fatigue system is gone, which I think detracted somewhat from the original game. Essentially, the combat looks and feels closer to something like Persona 5 Royal now, making the game a lot more polished. But there are plenty of things that haven't really changed. The game world is still relatively small, with a handful of constrained locations to visit during typical play. You can visit more locations at night, but the general layouts are very similar to Persona 3's original incarnation. It's a smaller world than Persona 5 for sure, although it's still basically functional as a backdrop for the story. Tartarus, the game's towering dungeon environment, is still much the same as before as well. It's now presented from an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, and there's more visual variety between the different areas, but it remains procedurally generated, so the levels don't present interesting challenges or puzzles. Persona 5 had handcrafted dungeons with all kinds of interesting stuff, and modern Atlus titles don't tend to rely on proceduralism as much, so this might not come off too well to some players. As an entry point into the Persona series, I think Persona 5 Royal is probably a better game to start with than Persona 3 Reload. But for players who like this style of game already, Persona 3 Reload has a lot to offer. It's still the same great Persona 3 experience, updated with new graphics, a better and clearer interface, and heavily revised turn-based gameplay. Plus, the new voice acting is very good, and the soundtrack, which has been completely re-recorded and features some new songs as well, is excellent. There's a lot to love here for sure. From a visual perspective, the game has its ups and downs, but I think it looks reasonable enough for the most part. With some lighting tweaks, I think it could be a substantially better experience though, and I would like to see some improvement, either player-led or from Atlus themselves, on that front. Current-gen console performance is solid at least, with the game combining ray tracing, 4K rendering, and a 60fps update on PS5 and Series X. So overall, I really liked Persona 3 Reload. It's not going to suit everyone's tastes, but I think a lot of players will really appreciate what it has to offer. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.